One live. Good evening, everybody. I'm Evelyn Cotter, the CEO and founder of Seven Career Coaching, and I'm really excited to bring you tonight's webinar with Mel Pritchard, who is an expert in mental health. She's also a life and career coach, and she's going to be giving you lots of practical tips to help you manage your stress and anxiety in these crazy, unusual and uncertain times. So welcome, Mel.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I'm very happy to be here with you all.
Yes, we're really excited. We already have a few people in the chat box. Just to let you know, everyone that's listening, feel free to make comments, ask questions. We love it when it's really interactive, and Mel will get to your points as she works through the content. So feel free to shout out in any way that you need to as we go through, or even just tell us what your circumstances are and the challenges maybe that you're currently dealing with, so we can kind of bring it more specifically into the content. So first of all, just to introduce Mel, Mel is somebody who you actually give really amazing workshops on mental health to different types of organizations, and it's a passion of yours, isn't it? Something you've been doing for quite a while. Tell us a little bit more about that and how you find that useful in working with your coaching clients.
Absolutely. Well, the reason why I did the mental health first aid course is because I wanted to be able to tell sort of which clients were in a good enough mindset to affect change, essentially. And I wanted to learn how to spot the signs and symptoms of when maybe clients might be struggling a bit more in terms of mental illnesses, whether depression, anxiety, or beyond. So that was my motivation, and it's super helpful in supporting clients and knowing how I can help them best, really.
Great. And Mel, obviously the one of the kind of main motivators for us doing this webinar series is to help people in this current climate who are, dealing with stress and anxiety, but a level of uncertainty. We all are dealing with that. That's unprecedented. Like, what are the themes that you're hearing, through your own clients and through your own networks? What are the biggest challenges people are facing right now? And if anyone in the chat box wants to let us know what their biggest challenges are, do let us know, and Mel can kind of help you out with those.
Absolutely, that's a great question, Evelyn. One thing I'm sure we'd all agree on is we're all incredibly different, and this is a core part of the mental health training that I do. We're not the same. So I'm hearing lots of varied challenges from, I've got a best friend who's got a new baby, and she's got a full-time job. So she's thinking, crikey, how the heck do I challenge being a full-time mum, looking after my baby, and getting my husband more involved? How can I manage all those things? Equally, I have friends who are freelancers, who run their own businesses, who might be finding their work is falling away a little. So they're worrying about financial stuff, about debt, about how to innovate, how to use technology like this that we're using, all sorts of different stresses and strains. And the latter group, some of those are actually finding this quite a welcome break because they have a bit more time and space. But of course, other people might be finding quite the opposite. Let's say you struggle with, say, depression, or you don't normally struggle with mental illness, but you're dealing with lots and lots of changes across maybe your accommodation, living with parents or partners or friends, perhaps in small student accommodation, kitchens that are being shared. There are so many different challenges that people are facing right now.
Wow. So, Mel, one of the points that you just made there is obviously people are incredibly different. And I think one of the most powerful things, just in the prep that we were doing earlier, you were talking me through, why some people are more susceptible to stress than others. I know you're going to go through that with a really lovely graph that we hope to share with you all, if we can get the screen share working later on. But first of all, I know you wanted to start off by explaining what stress is, and then we can sort of go into how stress affects different people and why it has a different impact on different individuals.
That's a great question, Evelyn. And Evelyn and I were having a chat earlier, and I was sharing something that really surprised me when I started working in this field about stress, and where it comes from and why we actually get stressed. And what I learned was stress is a reaction dating all the way back to caveman days. And it's what helps us to decide whether to be on fight, flight, or freeze sort of reaction. So if you think about us back in the caves, it was really helpful to get stressed so we could be on high alert for things like enemy attack, animals charging at us, maybe big old dinosaurs coming for us. That stress alerted us to needing to run and run fast so we could protect ourselves. So in many ways, things like stress and anxiety are incredibly helpful. they become less helpful when the stress that we're feeling or the anxiety we feel becomes disproportionate to the threat. And that's when we might be feeling quite overwhelmed, maybe overthinking, ruminating, and possibly even moving into that sort of mental health challenge, anxiety, depression territory.
So what's the difference between normal stress, good stress, anxiety, and you know, just for anybody watching this, obviously I think everybody's feeling a degree of anxiety. Even just social distancing is kind of, I think, odd for everybody. But what are the differences between good stress, bad stress, and where it's getting into more of a mental health sort of issue?
That's an excellent question, Evelyn. So good stress. I'd like you all just to take maybe 20 seconds on your own now. Just have a reflect on a time in your life when you felt stressed and it's been helpful. Just take a moment and have a think.
Can you give an example?
Okay, so an example might be, let's say the first time I did a presentation at work, I might have been thinking, oh my gosh, I've got 20 people, they're all watching me. I've never done a presentation before. I feel stressed. I'm going to mess this up. However, ultimately, that stress really helped to focus my mind. It helped me prepare my slides well. It helped me practice well, and it helped me perform well. So for me, that was a really positive example of stress working for me. Does that help clarify a bit?
Yeah.
Yep. So there's an example of good stress. Other examples might be, let's say we're feeling stressed about something in a new relationship, and that might feel quite overwhelming, but that might push us to having a very open, honest conversation and showing our vulnerability. And that might bring us closer to that person that we are feeling quite anxious about. What's he thinking? What's he feeling? So that stress provokes connection. So there are a couple of really nice examples of stress working for us, whether it's an interview, in work presentations, running a race really well, all sorts of different times when stress really works for us. So when does stress start working against us? So stress starts to become problematic, as I said, when it becomes disproportionate to the threat. So I'll give you an example here that I'm sure many of you will relate to from the online dating world. I'm sure most of us have all had relationships of sorts. So I've got a wonderful best friend, really charismatic, fantastic girl, brilliant teacher, very attractive to men, but she struggles with stress in relationships. So you may relate to this. Disclaimer. Occasionally she'll text a guy she really, really likes. They're in a relationship. Let's say he's at a wedding with friends and he doesn't respond for, say, 2 hours. Now her mind is going into all sorts of ruminations, catastrophizing. What's he doing? Who's he with? Has he met someone? So there's an example of when stress becomes disproportionate to the situation. And when we find ourselves in that situation too much, sometimes it can be a signal that you might be struggling a bit in terms of mental health. But of course, we all catastrophize, generalize, ruminate at times. So it's a little bit more complex than that.
And with the current climate, I know that anyone watching and anyone who signed up for this is probably, you know, if you think about it, really at the moment, everyone's dealing with different levels of uncertainty. Some people have been made unemployed recently. I mean, a lot of people have. Some people have been put on furlough, which is, you know, kind of paused and let's see how the company does and we'll get back to you sort of thing. And some people may feel very insecure about their employment or just their future in general. As you said, you know, we know lots of self-employed and freelance people who, you know, work has dried up and companies or individuals are afraid to invest right now. How does stress come into dealing with uncertainty, and how can you, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? How can people manage dealing with uncertainty on a day-to-day basis when, you know, maybe it's going to be a while before we do get clear answers, or even, you know, for a lot of us, we don't know how long we're going to be in lockdown. I know for some schools, they've said they're not now going back until September. So that's kind of an indicator that it's not necessarily going to be just a 2-week or a 4-week process.
Absolutely, Evelyn. Well, you mentioned the big buzzword here. Certainty is one of the 3 core human needs. So our certainty is in flux across, if we think about it, pretty much every area of our life right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our work might be in flux. Maybe we're unemployed. Maybe we're scared of losing our job. Maybe we're losing clients. Our love lives may be affected, whether it's dating whether it's having to suddenly live with a new boyfriend, whether it's being in a different country from your boyfriend. Our finances might be up in flux. So if you think about it, every part of our lives might feel uncertain here. So we can see why there's been such a collective reaction of stress to this, unprecedented situation. So I think we need to be kind to ourselves here, because just to reassure you guys, in my mental health training, we brainstorm the causes of stress, and we can all relate to a few for sure across the course of our lives. But it's rare to be dealing with so much uncertainty across so many potential areas of our lives. So you're right, that uncertainty is a huge trigger factor here. Tony Robbins himself says certainty is absolutely critical in our sense of well-being. So we can see why we're really struggling in that sense. Does that answer your question, Evelyn?
It does. I mean, one of the points it actually lends itself well to is Will, one of the coaches from the 7 team, gave a webinar last night, and one of the points he made was about psychological safety and how to create psychological safety, because actually in many ways our sense of security, whether it's kind of physical or not, really, if we can kind of give ourselves some form of psychological safety, we will, likely make better decisions, be less reactive, and just not overreact, or not kind of be defensive or whatever. One question James has just mentioned there, and thanks, Anna. I'll just get to that in a second as well. James has mentioned he is a key worker and he's required to work at the moment with students in schools. He said, colleagues and I are torn between wanting to do the right thing for our country and community by being in work to support the system, but also the need to protect ourselves and our family from the virus. And he's saying that is creating quite a bit of anxiety. What's the best way to manage it? And obviously that's very specific, but one of the things I relate to a lot is even just walking down the street right now, or being in a store, we're all sort of feeling that level of anxiety when someone gets a bit too close, or if someone sneezes or coughs, where it's because, it's a lot, isn't it? How would you kind of advise someone like James to, I know it's complex question, James, it's not kind of a one-stop shop, but what would you advise someone like James to do, Mel, at the moment?
That is a really challenging scenario, and I salute you firstly, James, for being on the front line, because that's probably triggering a lot of stress and conflict within you, because you're not in control of not doing that right now. I imagine you feel a great deal of sort of integrity in carrying out that function, so that's sort of been taken out of your hands, and I'm guessing you might be feeling conflicted emotions, like maybe you're feeling guilty that you're worried about yourself, which is very natural. Of course you are. That's a survival instinct. Maybe you're feeling shame that you're worrying about yourself when you really also deeply care about your students. So you're probably watching a lot of different confusing emotions, from integrity, commitment, passionate desire to help, with also worrying about yourself, your family, your own interests. So I think the first thing I would say that is key here, much like what I believe Ollie was saying, is the importance of being your own best friend. So really developing that kind, loving inner voice. We all think all sorts of things day to day that we might be embarrassed by, ashamed of. But what we can do when we start judging ourselves is we can ask ourselves, what would I say to my best friend right now? And try and just reframe that negative inner voice, that judgmental inner voice, that scared inner voice, to a reassuring, loving voice that we might expect to hear from someone really close to us. And the great thing about that, if you're thinking, oh golly, that sounds terribly trite and glib and contrived, the great thing is your subconscious believes anything you tell it. So if you feed your brain anything enough, even if you don't initially believe it, it will start to believe it itself. So really try and reframe that negative inner voice. And I would also say, sort of turning towards who can really support you best, who in your life is your sort of go-to person. Maybe you've got 2 or 3 people who really bulletproof you at wobbly times like that. Who is it that can really help you step back, get clarity? Who can really reassure you? Who are those go-to high quality people? Because Harvard scientists show that surrounding yourself with those high quality people is what really boosts stability and happiness. So I would really be mindful about who you're talking to, particularly at wobbly moments in life. And also that key question, identifying what you're in control of versus what you're not in control of. Because James, unfortunately, you can't control, of course, whether you go into school. That's something that's coming with your key worker role, and that's really challenging. But there might be other things that you can control. For example, how much you look at the media, for example, to what extent you're being exposed to more negative, panicky friends who are maybe offloading onto you. So have a look at what you can control and what you can't control, and try and turn your attention to what you can control. Maybe it's positive daily habits and routines, like eating really delicious food that nourishes your mind, because we know that has a bearing on the brain's development. Maybe it's going for a run, if that's what really, energizes you and helps you calm down and release stress. Maybe it's writing in a journal, if that's something that you find helpful, really sort of almost like vomiting the negative emotions and the stresses out onto paper. Because the beauty of that is, I'm sure we've all been there, we're completely honest when we're writing in diaries. We don't sugarcoat anything. We're not trying to impress anyone. We're not trying to tell stories to ourselves or to anyone else. We're being entirely honest. And that in itself is deeply cathartic.
That's such a good point, Mel. And James just pointed out, actually, he said addiction to the 5 p.m. media briefing is a real issue. Good point.
Yeah.
I don't know if you found this, Mel, but I've actually stopped reading the news and watching the news for the last probably week, just because I found it bringing me down and getting overwhelming, because of course, it's a huge tragedy. There's a lot of suffering, but at the same time, we've when we are all facing so much change and so much uncertainty, it's really important, as you're saying, to be selective about what you're exposing yourself to. And our brains are, they're incredibly malleable and porous in terms of we really absorb, don't we, who we're around, what we're listening to, what we're watching. So it's important to be mindful. Just another really good sort of question here from Anna. Anna said she struggled with anxiety. It's been something she's always struggled with. And she said in this climate, it's now getting quite bad. She's on a contract as a recruiter, which she now knows is not going to be extended due to the climate that we're all in. She said it's becoming kind of real to her now that it may take her a very long time to find a new role. How do you deal with a situation like this in a positive manner?
That's a great question. So I would say there are a couple of issues here. There's the uncertainty around your immediate job that it sounds like you might be losing. Is that right, Evelyn? So there's a fear around losing her job.
She's on a contract, so she said it's not going to get renewed. So she's probably now going to face unemployment.
Okay. So there are two issues here. There's the fear around your actual job and, potentially losing your job and how you find another job. And then there's how can you support your mental health and well-being? That sounds challenging, actually. And actually, anxiety is a very common mental health illness, as I'm sure many of us are aware of. So I would say, firstly, ask yourself, parking the job stuff for now, what supported you in the past when you've felt sort of more challenged by your feelings of anxiety? Who have you connected to in the past that's really supported you at this moment? It might be, I know that I have a couple of best friends, I'm sure you guys all do, who are, I would say, almost like trained counselors. One is the wonderful teacher I mentioned. She's got such exceptional listening skills that I would have thought she was a trained counselor. So I noticed that at difficult times where our mental health is more sort of in flux, it's very important to connect with people who are excellent listeners, who really hear how you're feeling, what the underlying struggles are for you. And what I would encourage you to do, Anna, is if you can't think of anybody who's really supported you at quite wobbly moments in the past around your anxiety, maybe you've had a counsellor before. This might be a really wonderful moment to reconnect with a counsellor. As we know, lots of people are working online at the moment. And if you can't find anyone in the immediate, there are at least 3 other positive options for you. So the first one is a wonderful app called BetterHelp. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of it. I believe they have trained counsellors on the end of the app that you can connect with, who can support you. So that's one option. Look up BetterHelp. Another option is you can actually call counselling organisations direct. And if you're worrying about money right now, something many people don't realise is that lots of these organisations offer bursaries. So they may well give you a discount, or rather wonderfully, they sometimes refer you to someone who's training in the field, who can still be highly skilled, but the great news is possibly much cheaper. So those are some options in terms of how you can get that high level support from people who have, training in counseling listening skills. Because just ask yourself this question right now. How do you feel when you connect with someone who really, really listens well? And now ask yourself the opposite. How have you been left feeling in moments of real struggle when you've listened to someone who is a terrible listener? Exactly. So if you really are struggling with potential mental illness right now, it's very important to have that high quality listening. And if you can't find that in lieu of those suggestions, remember that Mindline and the Samaritans are free, confidential helplines with trained listeners, and they really are superb. I used to work on Mindline, and sometimes we'd have people calling up in psychosis or suicidal, and I can't even begin to express the shift that can happen in half an hour when you have a great listener there who's really holding you in that sort of difficulty and challenge. So those would be my top tips around how you can sort of support yourself through potential mental illness. Would you like me to give you a couple of thoughts on the job uncertainty there? So
yeah, she's saying yes, please.
Okay, fantastic, Anna. So it's very normal, firstly, Anna, to feel stressed, and just try and really be kind to yourself at this moment. The good news is there are certainly some positive things you can be doing. I was discussing this with someone earlier this week, and here are some of my top tips. So I guess the first one is asking yourself, because it's possible, it's normal that you're questioning this, but it's also possible that you might be worrying about something that won't happen. So the first question you might ask is, what evidence do I have of this? Now, you might all be thinking, well, isn't that pretty obvious, Mel? A coronavirus, loads of people are losing their jobs. So it's a very normal fear to have. But do you actually have any evidence? That's the first thing. And that might calm you down initially. Something else you could do is actually, ironically, talk to some recruiters, obviously outside your organization, and talk to them about your worries. Ask them, I'm worried about this. What are your thoughts? Ask for their advice around job markets that might be thriving more than others right now, because they'll be able to look at your CV, Anna, and see some of your real killer strengths and experience, and they'll be able to maybe suggest linked areas if the worst does happen, that you could slide into, whether it's temporarily or long term, to make ends meet. So much as recruiters can get a bad rep as being sort of sleazy and slimy, I have to say I've spoken to a couple in my lifetime who have been nothing short than life-changing at essential sort of transitional moments in terms of A, their market knowledge, B, their contacts. They take all the stress out of having to do applications, of having to even do proper interviews, and they can essentially introduce you to someone that they have a pre-existing connection with. So have a think about recruiters that you can connect with. Maybe doing it sooner rather than later might ease your mind, because then you're getting a contingency plan in place. So that's one suggestion. Another suggestion is, if you're thinking, actually, you know what, either I love recruitment and I definitely want to find a similar job, or actually, maybe some of you are in a similar situation and you think, I don't actually really even like my job that much. This might be a good time, rather relevantly, talking to career coaches to get some career coaching. Because sometimes if you're clear, you can move into that field quite well if you're confident on how to do great applications, CV, cover letters, interviews. But if you're not clear, you know what, this can be such a beautiful opportunity for getting that clarity. And I'm sure Evelyn will agree, because we're both really passionate about career coaching. Getting clear on what your needs are, what your values are, what you need to be having in your career to be happy longer term is so essential to feeling a sense of purpose, joy, excitement, and really making a difference. So I'd also encourage you, Anna, if any part of you isn't clear, have a think about career coaching as well as a possible avenue, because it can pay dividends in the long term.
I think there's so much good stuff there, and hopefully I think you might need to rewatch this and just take it all in. I think some awesome tips from Mel there. What's interesting though, and something I was wanting to ask you, Mel, is just because I've come across this with coaching clients and with my own personal life with friends and family as well. But how do you know when maybe you're in a place of kind of normal anxiety? And how do you know when maybe you're broaching something that's more on the mental health, or I think the point one of, and you haven't kind of gone through it early yet, but one of the points in our prep earlier, you were talking about an example, a visual that you use, and how different people have the capacity different levels of stress. Do you want to talk people through that and then sort of tie in how do you know when anxiety is kind of, it's okay, it's manageable, or actually maybe I really do need to take this seriously and nip it in the bud and speak to trained professionals?
Then yeah, I'd love to do that. Before we look at the visual, just to answer that question that's in there, and it's a great question, Evelyn. What's the difference between anxiety and an anxiety disorder, or feeling down and actual depression? Very important question. There are a couple of top high level tips I can give you guys here. So as we know, we all experience highs and lows throughout life, particularly at the moment. So it might be harder to differentiate those lows. However, in terms of spotting mental illness generally, here are a couple of top tips. So everyone has different norms. So let's take Evelyn as an example. She's super bubbly, super friendly, super chatty. So if I came into the office, I'd probably expect Evelyn to be smiley, bubbly, asking lots of questions. We'd be having a lot of fun. Now, if I walked into Seven another day and Evelyn was sitting there quietly, didn't acknowledge me, looked quite pale and withdrawn, and I said, oh, should we go out for drinks like we always do on Tuesdays? And she seemed quite at odds with how she normally is. That would be a possible indication of potential mental illness, maybe depression, maybe anxiety, maybe something else. Why? Because there's a shift in Evelyn's norms. Now, this can work the other way. So let's say you work or you have someone in your family who's kind of the opposite sort of personality. Maybe they're usually quite quiet and withdrawn, and that's just how they are. Maybe they suddenly become quite exuberant and behaving in really quite a different way. Maybe they start boozing loads when normally they don't drink. Maybe they just start behaving in a way that doesn't feel normal to them or you. Again, you're noticing a shift in their norms. So obviously we're all observing shifts in our norms every day. So you might be thinking, well, that sounds really quite hard to spot. But you'll know your family and your friends well, you will know them well. You'll be able to intuitively feel those shifts. And I would encourage you, if you feel that, to reach out and connect with them. Another giveaway for the difference between sort of common anxiety and depression that we might all feel at different points in our lives and an actual illness or disorder is when you're feeling down more than up for a period of at least 2 weeks. Again, that might sound quite hard to sort of get perspective on right now. But the usual standard is if you're feeling down more than up for at least 14 days, that's the minimal time period for a diagnosis of depression, you might be struggling with something more sort of diagnostic. And in that sense, you might also notice behaviors that will push you potentially more into mental illness zone. So you might notice that you're struggling with day-to-day things that usually feel very normal to you. So let's say normally you bounce out of bed, you cook yourself delicious meals, your mum and your best friend every day, but you're actually really struggling with all of that. And maybe you're struggling to even focus on work and even make decisions. Maybe you're struggling with your memory. If you're noticing those sorts of behaviors, you might be sort of into what experts might call sort of disability zone, which is what lots of mental illnesses actually fall into, where you're struggling to function in a way that's normal for you day to day. So that's just a quick summary of the difference between the ups and downs of life, feeling a bit down, and actual depression and anxiety. Does that help?
I think that's excellent. I think one point I'd like to just make to Anna or anyone listening is, if you're in doubt, from what Mel's describing, if you're still not sure where you sit, whether it's calling a free helpline, or whether it is investing a little bit in speaking to counsellors, I can't imagine you'll regret it. I think we're better safe than sorry. And the one other thing that I over the years I've noticed, mental health kind of disorders or anxiety disorders, and maybe Mel can talk a little bit more about this in a sec, but sometimes they creep up on people. And actually, if they had taken like the early signs more seriously and reached out for help, I mean, I think a lot of people, I've seen people just being quite dismissive. And unfortunately, over time, something has crept up on them, and it becomes much bigger. And as you said, it's disabled them in their lives, and it's really taken a long time to get over. And I think right now, that's the last thing you or anybody needs. It's if you're really feeling like, I don't want this to go any further. What's the harm in reaching out to someone and getting some support in whatever way you can afford, or whatever way feels right for you right now? I think people need to listen to themselves, and if they feel a little bit unsure or a little bit in the danger zone, I think if you just quiet your mind, you can kind of think, yeah, maybe I am a little bit, this is a bit more than just normal anxiety, then reach out to somebody, and you know, I don't
Yeah.
think you can go too far wrong.
No, you just said so many powerful things in there, Evelyn. Thank you for sharing that. So as you said, early intervention is essential because all we hear in the media, let's be honest, is negative stories about mental illness. It's all very black and white and catastrophic. It doesn't actually reflect a lot of what's really going on. You know, there are mild and moderate forms of all these illnesses, which are terribly common. 1 in 4 of us will suffer, probably a lot more because people aren't always open about it. 99 million sick days are taken a year for mental health reasons. So they're really, really prevalent. And as Evelyn said, early intervention is key. So the sooner that you can sort of reach out if you're worried about yourself or someone else, the sooner you can get a possible diagnosis. The great news is the sooner you're going to recover, whether that's managing that for the next few weeks or potentially months, or making an absolutely full recovery, which we don't often hear about in the sort of, sensationalist press, but it does happen a lot more than we know. And another excellent point that you made, Evelyn, is not realizing sometimes, and this idea of, more challenging feelings creeping up on you. So, mental health and mental illness, it's a spectrum we all move around. There's sort of mental health on one side and well-being on the other. And we all move around this throughout our lives, and we can be pushed into different zones very quickly. So let's say you're in the best possible zone, what I call the Instagram or Facebook ideal zone, the Facebook happy zone. So let's say, like Evelyn, you've got a handsome husband and a gorgeous baby living in a beautiful sunny place. Your life looks pretty darn enviable to the outside world. But let's imagine that Evelyn's handsome partner leaves her, and maybe her baby becomes seriously ill. She could quite quickly move from a really positive, happy, strong place to a place of real challenge. So even though she still looks like the same beautiful Evelyn, she could be really struggling inside. And unless she actually shares that, we might have no idea. So let's not forget that mental health struggles can be invisible, and no one's invulnerable. They affect everyone, the thin, the bigger, the beautiful, the less beautiful, the rich, the less wealthy. Look at Robin Williams. He had it all and probably looked like the happiest chap to the whole world, but actually, unfortunately, as we now know, was really struggling with some quite serious challenges, and sadly took his life in the end. So it's good to just remember that we're all human, and we can all be sort of moved into different territories for all number of reasons that we're going to look at during this session.
And Mel, one of the things, just in relation to James's point earlier, and even to Anna, it's been a theme through the webinars we've done this week with all of the coaches we've spoken to so far, has been really kind of taking things on a day-to-day, in a day-to-day way right now, just because there is a high level of uncertainty. The leaders of our countries don't kind of know what's going on. So there's a huge amount of confusion as well at some levels, and sensationalism in the press. But what can people like Anna and James do on a day-to-day level and in a practical way, just to help them feel more solid? Or, as you said, there's certain things we can control, and there's things we can't. What can they do practically?
So I think the first thing I would say, and we'll look at this visual in a minute, which will explain this in a really lovely, punchy way, is we all have positive coping mechanisms. Even before coronavirus happened, we've all probably got what I call like 3 things that bulletproof our day-to-day or our week by week. So Evelyn, can you think of 3 or 2 or 3 things that you do that always energize you, give you a buzz when you're feeling stressed, that recenter you, that ground you and bring you back into balance? Can you think of a couple?
Well, just before we jumped on this webinar, I did 40 minutes of vinyasa flow. So my yoga practice, which goes up and down. Sometimes I'm amazing, I'm a guru of yoga, and other times I am really not. But yoga always brings me back into center. And I mean, right now, I just think walks. I'm one that likes. I like a good walk with lots of fresh air. It clears my mind, and I like a bit of space away from people. So that a good walk away from everyone by the sea, preferably, is always a good one for me as well.
Lovely. Well, there we are. 3 great examples. So what I would encourage you to do, particularly now more than ever, is ask yourself, what 3 things bulletproof your life day to day, week by week? So if you think of times when you felt wobbly, or anxious or overwhelmed or really quite scared, what things have brought you back into center? So for example, for me, whenever I write, whether it's journaling or writing articles, I always feel more like myself. I also know that going into nature calms me down. It inspires me. I also know that, look, here's an example for you live. Scented candles, that lovely aroma of rose, engaging with my limbic system, which controls emotions, is also deeply calming. So ask yourself, whenever you're wobbling, particularly if you're on the front line or otherwise, what 3 things bulletproof my life, which really support me and lift me up? And just ask yourself, and how much have I been doing those? So let's say running is one of your 3 things. Ask yourself, when was the last time I went for a run? And I'm pretty sure the answer will be, oh, too long ago. So try and have a quick sort of well-being audit on those 3 bulletproof things and ask yourself, how much more of those could I be doing if I've been neglecting them? So that's a very easy win. If you like, I can show you that visual just to sort of flesh that out for you, or we can whiz on, whatever you prefer, Evelyn.
Yeah, let's, I'm going to attempt to share my screen if I can see where to do that. For some reason, it's now disappeared.
Sorry.
Oh, here we go. I've got it.
Fabulous.
So I'm just going to share my screen now, and then
very exciting. Modern technology at its very best. Everyone.
So this is, yeah, Mel, you can talk people through.
It might be a little bit small. I'm not quite sure how much you guys can see there, but it's great to have it here. So I love this visual aid that we use on the mental health first aid course. So you guys can see that we all have something called a stress container or a stress bucket. And this explains the relationship between stress and vulnerability levels and why some of us just seem to glide through life. You know, anything can be thrown at us, divorce, heartache, job loss, but oh, you know, they seem just absolutely fine. How do they do it? While other people might feel like they're crumbling inside and really can't cope. So let's have a look at how this works. So you can see that green triangle, that is what we call our stress bucket. Now we all have a stress bucket or stress container, and that's what stress flows into. So you can see those green arrows are showing the stress flowing into your stress bucket. Now, we all have a different size bucket. So let's imagine for a moment that your stress bucket is quite small. So you've got a small space that stress is flowing into. Any guesses as to what that says about your vulnerability levels if you've got a small stress bucket? What does that say about your vulnerability levels if there isn't much space for stress to flow into? Any guesses? You can always have a guess, Evelyn.
So if you have a smaller bucket, I know because you told me earlier, you have less capacity for stress, so you tend to overflow more.
Absolutely. What a fantastic summary. Exactly. There's not so much space for stress. So unsurprisingly, your bucket fills up faster. And what happens when the stress reaches the top? It was that magic word you said, it overflows.
Yeah.
Yeah. When that overflowing happens, all sorts of things can happen. It could be sort of minor things like snapping, emotional snapping at people close to us, or it could be more serious things like burnout, breakdown, or something more serious like depression or beyond. So let's have a think about the opposite. Imagine your stress bucket is much bigger, and that's what stress flows into. What does that say about your vulnerability levels, do you think?
You're far more resilient, I would say, because you can take more.
Absolutely. Spot on. You're more resilient. You can take more. So it takes longer to fill up and overflow, but it can still fill up to the top. So we don't want to assume that people who seem super strong and tough, these frontline sort of key workers, you know, are superheroes who are invulnerable either. Any guesses as to what the little tap at the bottom means? You can see a little grey tap there. Can anyone guess what that does?
Is that sort of a release? A way
Absolutely.
we can release?
Exactly. So that's a release. It's like a sort of little stress valve. So when we open that, by engaging with those positive coping mechanisms that we just discussed, whether it's the running, the yoga, the writing, that releases the stress and it reduces the stress level and brings us back into balance. So we've discussed some of our helpful coping strategies. What kind of coping strategies do you guys find less helpful in your life? So are stressed, what sort of things have you ever engaged in that really drag you down, make you feel worse, maybe even more overwhelmed? Can anyone be quite sort of open and honest here? Nothing will shock, by the way. I've seen and heard it all. Probably done most of these myself.
Chocolate wine. Jane says. Wine feels good when you're drinking it. It feels good. That's just chocolate. It's just after. Not the fall. I know. I agree. Not the following morning.
as well as checking in with our positive coping strategies, those bulletproof things that really boost us, we can also ask ourselves, which unhelpful coping strategies are bringing me down right now? So I know for me, for example, I've been going to bed far too late recently, reading the news, and other things. So that's been making me feel more tired and probably more stressed. So I'm aware that that's an unhelpful coping strategy. And I've also limited my wine intake or vodka martini intake to 1 glass a day.
Oh, that's good. That's
Exactly.
I think with all this social isolation, the days do seem quite long. So we do get to the end of the day, and I always think, well, I think I deserve a little drinky poos. But I think that's a bit of a trap that we can fall into right now, because we're not really as busy, are we? So looking for rewards somewhere, but maybe not in the bottle.
Showing ourselves, what's positive and what's negative for us. So just to give you guys a quick piece of helpful info there, you'll notice we spoke about different sized buckets, and you might be thinking, gosh, how big is my stress container? And it's not fair. Why is mine sort of small and hers is big? What's going on there? Well, I'm going to ask you a quick question here. To what extent do you think, percentage-wise, genetics determine your resilience levels? Can anyone have a guess for us? What's the percentage influence of our genetics on our resilience levels? Anyone brave enough to guess? What do you think?
I don't actually know, but I would imagine genetics. I would imagine it's more of a nurture over nature, personally.
That's quite interesting. I'd say the answer is pretty much that, actually. So our genetics account for about 50% in determining our resilience levels. So let's say that your parents are really quite resilient. You might have sort of won the lottery of life there. But if your parents aren't, you might be panicking and thinking, uh-oh, I'm screwed. My parents aren't remotely resilient. But I would say don't panic, because the other 50% are tools that you can learn to build that muscle. So it's not black and white. Just as Evelyn said, it's nature and nurture. So on top of genetics, we also have factors like how you were raised when you were really small. So let's say you've had people who raised you who are really positive, like, come on, darling, you can do it. You can overcome this challenge. That's obviously going to build a strong resilience muscle, a strong sense of self-esteem, versus perhaps if you've had less good fortune in that sense, or maybe even abusive parents in the worst case. So that's why we might have slightly different size buckets. But as I said, the positive news is we can learn how to build that muscle through positive mindset tricks, which we're going to share even more of.
And Mel, does that kind of does that link in with? I mean, a lot of our self-talk comes from those early developmental years, the voices that we heard as children. We kind of take them in, don't we? And we kind of they become our self-talk. Does that sort of tie in with essentially the sort of influence of those adults that were around us in our early years and the quality of our self-talk?
Yeah, it has a huge bearing. It really does. But it isn't the be all and end all, because let's say you've had really supportive voices around you as a child, and then let's say you engage in, let's say, an abusive or slightly toxic relationship. Probably a lot of us can relate to that situation where your previously positive, strong voice becomes really quite triggered, and you might sort of notice a real shift in your negative inner monologue. You might notice reducing levels of self-esteem. So that's one of the key points here when we think about the stress bucket. And stress full stop. There are all sorts of triggers in life that can tip us into different zones, whether it's relationship breakdown, health, things like coronavirus, whether it's accommodation issues that we might be experiencing now, living with boyfriends or parents or people we don't necessarily thrive with, things like how much we're sleeping, financial worries, what our sort of connectedness to family and friends are, how high quality those relationships are. So any sort of shifts in all number of life stresses can tip us into a different zone as well. But certainly our upbringing does have a sort of influential bearing.
Mm-hmm. And Mel, one of the really fun kind of examples of different types of thinking you mentioned earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a great one actually I know Timmy's just made a few comments, and Anna, thank you both, and James. But could you talk us through a little bit about how our thinking affects stress and anxiety, and then kind of go through the different types of thinking maybe people will relate to? There's some funny ones I always think when we think about it.
So this is my absolutely sort of favorite trick that I learned through the mental health training I did. You guys have probably heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a great sort of support for people suffering from mild to moderate depression or anxiety. However, the great news is this is also, I would say, a life-changing mind management trick, which I absolutely love. So what's it about? Every time we have a thought, that creates a feeling, and that feeling usually creates a behavior. So our thoughts create feelings, and that creates a behavior. So let's think of an example here. Let's say you do a work presentation and you're nervous about it. You think that it goes pretty well by and large, but maybe you mess up one slide. And rather than thinking, well done me, you start maybe engaging with what we call a cognitive distortion. This is where the trouble starts. You might start thinking catastrophic thoughts like, oh my gosh, I really messed that up. I'm going to lose my job. And that might be the feeling that you get, and that might impact on your behavior. You might never put yourself forward for that sort of work again. And maybe you kind of shrivel into yourself at work and start sort of, becoming more sort of withdrawn around your boss. So that thought brings about unpleasant feelings that has an impact on your behavior, and that can become a vicious cycle. So let's have a quick look at a couple of very common, and sometimes they can sound quite funny, actually, as Evelyn said, cognitive distortions. So this is the best one that I like to give. If we're in a room here, I'd say hands up if anyone has ever online dated before. I'm pretty sure that's probably a large chunk of our audience right now. Who can relate to this example? So you're swiping through online dating. Maybe you've been through, I don't know, 50 guys or girls, and there's no one that excites you. And you start thinking that dreadful thought of, oh my gosh, there are no good men left, for example, or no good women left. I'm screwed. I think we can all. I've certainly never thought that one myself. What kind of cognitive distortion can you spot there? Can you remember a couple of those, Evelyn? So what kind of distortion might that be? There are no good men left. I'm never going to get married. I'm screwed.
Is it black and white thinking?
Absolutely. That's certainly one of them. It's black and white thinking. It's either good or bad. There's no gray, helpful, realistic in between.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned earlier catastrophic thinking, which I think at the moment we are being like, you know, that's a lot of the media's kind of approach to this right now is catastrophic. It's you know, one of the things we're reassuring, or you know, anyone that we're speaking to through 7 when they're calling up is, you know, it has to eventually come to an end. Like nothing lasts forever. Everything in life is cyclical. You know, and so using black and white thinking to, you know, it's like, you know, this is it. We don't know when we're getting out of this, but of course it will come to an end this time next year, this time 6 months, this time even 3 months. You know, well, what are the other examples, Mel, of different kind of cognitive distortions?
So let's come back to, let's think about like an exam that you've ever done, because we've all done exams. We can all relate to this. You do the whole thing pretty well, but there's one question that you really don't conquer well, and you start thinking, oh my god, that's it, I failed, I'm never going to get into university. So that might be catastrophizing, as you said. Let's say you go for an interview and you don't get the job. You might start generalizing wildly and say, I'm never going to find a recruitment firm that wants me. You're generalizing wildly because that one job wasn't yours, when the reality might be that there is simply someone with 20 years experience on you. So what's really helpful here is to notice cognitive distortions arising. So we've mentioned some here: catastrophizing, so thinking the worst; black and white thinking, it's good or bad, there's no in between; negative mental filter, so that example of, say, doing a great work presentation when 95% is brilliant, but you just focus on that 5% that was slightly less than superb. Negative mental filter. And the other one, which I'm sure everyone will have a laugh about thinking about, is fortune telling. So I gave you the example of my lovely friend texting the guy that she was dating. He didn't respond within 2 hours, and she started fortune telling wildly. He's met someone else, he's going to dump me, creating stories in our minds. So those are some really common examples of cognitive distortions. The good news is, if we can learn to spot these and notice when they arise, that in itself sort of takes some sting out of the anxiety. So it's stepping back from the feeling and observing your thoughts as they arise. It's a form of mindfulness, really. So noticing, you can even say to yourself, oh, nice try, brain. I know what you're trying to do here. you're trying to bomb me to destruction, but I know that really that's just a distortion of reality. And then the great news is you can ask yourself a couple of very powerful transformative questions, like, firstly, what evidence do I have for this? So let's say with the coronavirus, obviously some people will be really worrying about potentially catching the coronavirus. So you might ask yourself, what evidence do I have of this if I step back from these terrifying headlines? And you might find that you start thinking in a different way, like, well, actually, not that much, because I'm social distancing. No one near me is sick right now. I'm taking every precaution I'm being advised to take. And also, I don't have any underlying health issues. So actually, gosh, how helpful. Actually, there isn't much evidence to suggest that I am really vulnerable to this right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or that if I get it, that I will end up dying, for example, because there are lots and lots of stories of people who get coronavirus and, like our lovely Prince Charles, experience really mild symptoms.
Yes.
So you ask yourself, what evidence do I have of this? Or what's an alternative way of looking at this? And again, that good old trick, what would I say to a best friend right now? And that will just take you back to a loving, much more positive, supporting inner voice that's much less sort of stress inducing.
And Mel, just to jump in, because I know this is at the top of a lot of people's minds that we're hearing from all week, and lends itself well to Anna's point. When somebody like Anna and a lot of people are in a position where maybe they're nervous about the security of their employment right now, and their financial security, obviously, that sends us into real survival mode, doesn't it? Because it affects our physical security. How can you, what would you recommend people do if they are in a place where they're very, very anxious and very nervous about their financial and employment security? Even using that kind of model of thinking, it's very easy to jump into, there are no jobs, I'm going to be unemployed forever. When actually, I get emails every day from different sort of job boards and all sorts of career-based fantastic kind of websites and blogs, but there's lots and lots and lots of remote jobs, and there's lots of hiring going on right now, because there are in fact industries who are thriving. Just to give an example, obviously anything to do with delivery, there's you've got kind of obviously online shopping is going through the roof, and grocery shopping, there's lots, and you've got platforms like this, Zoom. I know the cycling, I'm not a cyclist, but there's a cycling app. There's lots of different types of apps that are really booming. But how could you help someone in, say, Anna's position, or in anyone's position who's watching, who is nervous about and feeling very kind of anxious, and maybe is like naturally, I think, catastrophizing their chances of finding more employment or in financial of earning money, really?
That's important, asking that question, Evelyn, because this is a reality. So we're not actually, there's naturally going to be some catastrophizing, which feels genuinely like a real threat. I would ask yourself is a great method from Oprah Winfrey. What do I know for sure about my strengths and my skills and my experience, on my CV? So just bring yourself back to the positives. What do you know for sure about your killer strengths, your killer skills, and your killer experiences? Because, that's absolutely key. You have some great transferable skills. And even if you move into a linked area, even in the short term, those skills will make you highly desirable to certain employers, even if the area you work in, let's say recruitment right now, or another area that's been particularly hit, is likely to take a hit. So firstly, get back in touch with, remind yourself what your killer strengths are, what you know for sure, when you've excelled, try and get yourself into that good space. The second thing to do is to start trying to be resourceful. So this is a big part of the coaching process. What can I do to sort of kind of create contingency plans, if you like, whether it's talking to recruiters, career coaches, or even, I know this is a favorite of both Evelyn and I, the speculative approach, which for anyone who doesn't know is where you approach usually a company or a person who truly excites you, that you are nuts about. I always say this is much like love, careers and love. If you're nuts about them, chances are they could be a soulmate. So never that feeling of excitement, because you know what? Evidence of interest in a company and passion is the killer combo of selling yourself. So don't be afraid to not wait for the worst to happen. You can start by being proactive and resourceful. Have a research online. Are there any companies in my area or linked areas that truly excite me? Are there any people there, ideally fairly senior people, who I'd quite like to write a really well thought out little email, sort of cover letter to? And again, that's something that we do a lot of work around. So the key tip there, which sometimes clients don't do initially, is it's much like love. Seduce that person before you start selling yourself. So write them a thoughtful, bespoke message with 3 reasons why you're inspired and excited by what they do in the first sort of little paragraph. And then explain how your skills and experience might add value to them right now. So it might be, let's say I've got a client who's really interested in becoming a copywriter. And I said to him, this is a killer opportunity for you to potentially do some copywriting, start practicing your copywriting for friends who might be starting new businesses right now, or for other people who want to upgrade the content on their website to sell even more, to stand out at a stressful time in a stressful market. So there's lots of opportunity here to build connection, whether it's doing research for companies, whether it's working on their website, whether it's innovating for them. You will all have special killer skills here. Even if you think you don't, you'll have unique selling points that could really potentially add value to organizations. And what's also important to remember here is 40% of jobs aren't advertised. So if you're thinking, oh, but my favorite 3 companies, they're not recruiting. Au contraire, half the time you won't even know. Just get in touch with them with that method that I just suggested. Put yourself forward, even with a wonderfully flexible line like, I'm really, truly passionate about what you guys do. I'd love to add value with anything, sort of no matter how menial, because that foot in the door could lead you to your dream destination when this is all over. So be open-minded, be proactive, create a little chart noting down employers that you're coming across, companies, people that excite you, and then start thinking about speculative approaches, because they might be thinking about needing someone and you've just come along without them even having to put an ad out there. So keep an open mind and be proactive and sell yourself.
And actually one of the points as well, I think, just to sort of tie it in really nicely, is if you're able on a day-to-day basis, taking a lot of the tips that Mel has given, if you're managing your stress and anxiety as best as you can, and you're not going into that kind of fear-based survival mode, you're going to be in a much better place to be able to take the tips and actually, the speculative approach is something we've used for years, connecting with people online to get informational interviews, develop your network in new industries. These are all things you can be doing right now if you have extra time, if you have extra space. It's probably a much better time to do this than ever before, because from where I'm sitting, I think people are much more open right now and much more, everyone's in a more helpful kind of community-based kind of place right now. So I think it's a great time to do, if you're looking to change industry anyway, it's a great time to connect with people. But the basic stuff, if you're in a fear-based or survival mode, you're not going to be able to sit down and focus on being innovative. You're not going to be able to think outside the box. You're certainly not going to look at your skills and your offering in a positive way. And so you're really kind of sabotaging yourself. So that's why this is such an important topic, because on a day-to-day point, and as Mel said, we all move around that mental health kind of graph, as you were describing, all through our lives, depending on whatever's happening at any given time. But if you can just keep yourself in a good place and take every day at a time, and just being in as good a place as you can be emotionally, you will then, the quality of your actions and your behaviors will be much better for you in the short term, in the midterm, and in the long term. For some people, it is going to be difficult to get employment immediately. For others, there are remote jobs you could probably do. You've got people per hour. You've got, there's all these different platforms for freelance work or for remote work. We use quite a few of them, and there are companies hiring. So it's really good to sort of focus on whatever it is that's going to give you enough energy to be able to look after yourself. Because if you're in a fairly positive place, it's easier to look after yourself, and then you're able to do things that ultimately are going to be good for you. If you're not managing your stress and anxiety, it'll take over, and you sort of can slide down pretty quickly, and then you have to spend a lot of your energy in just getting yourself back to zero, which is such a waste when actually you could be, moving forward. Do you agree, Mel?
Definitely do. And if you guys would like just 3 sort of top tips for really inspiring videos that I guarantee will lift you up if you're thinking, but I just can't even do those things. 3 top tips. Google J.K. Rowling failure on YouTube. I defy you not to
Oh,
feel.
I think I've seen it. Yeah.
Great one. And this one is my favorite one. If you Google Buster Douglas, Mike Tyson resilience on YouTube, you'll find the most spine-tingling video you'll probably ever watch.
What was that again? Buster Douglas.
Buster Douglas resilience. If you Google those keywords on YouTube, you'll find a spine-tingling video on how Buster Douglas overcame probably one of the greatest barriers or hurdles of his life and ended up excelling. It was absolutely gobsmackingly brilliant, really. Yeah, so give those two a watch. They're both excellent, really, really inspiring. And remember, no matter how hard things feel, just like J.K. Rowling and her, many adversities, there's an opportunity in every problem. It's what Liggy Webb, the resilient leader, calls the probopportunity. So naturally, we can all feel, self-loathing or guilty or scared and frightened, and that's absolutely normal and terribly human right now. But in any problem, the problems I've just mentioned with J.K. Rowling and even Buster Douglas, they both had serious challenges going on. There's always an opportunity. There's always a silver lining. And just by asking yourself, what's the opportunity in this problem? You can actually shift your mind into a more positive space, out of that more victim space, which our brains are naturally defaulted to from that sort of caveman negative space. It's normal for us to be negative, but we can tripwire the brain by employing some of these techniques, whether it's, what 3 things bulletproof my life? What's the opportunity in this problem? What's the kind of positive reframe here? What would my best friend say to me? How can I challenge these cognitive distortions? So remember, it's like a muscle. So this is a really tough time right now, but honestly, we can really develop new neural pathways in our brains, no matter how challenging the time. I can assure you of that. But you have to remember, action builds belief. So the more you do it, the more you'll feel it, the more you'll believe it. But it is a muscle. So as Ruby Wax says, if you don't lose it, you use it. So you've got to practice it to feel the benefit. So just remember that. Have a play around, see which sort of inspire you and resonate the most, and keep doing that. It's all about small steps forward.
Exactly. And I think, just to finish up, I mean, your points have been absolutely perfect and it summarizes everything really well. I'm just typing in some little summary points as we go, just because people watch this afterwards and it's kind of helpful just to draw them out. But hopefully everybody watching, I think Mel has just given you so much value there. Definitely one that you're probably going to need to rewatch to take it all in. But really, really awesome points. And just to sort of let people know, we're from 7 Career Coaching. If you want to work with Mel or any of her coaches, we've got over 30 career coaches. Mel is a life and career coach. She works with people to change career, to help them sort of manage their mental health, but also kind of, do exciting things in their career as well. It's kind of a great offering. You can press there's a call to action button below, which brings you to our diary, and you can schedule a call with one of our team who'll talk you through how our programs work. And other than that, we will be emailing you the recording of this in the morning, and then any links or references Mel has mentioned, we're going to pop them in, and you can watch it or let us know what you think of the references. So thank you to everyone for your comments, James, Anna, Timmy. There's been lots of interaction there, which is amazing. And we're wishing you all the best. I know it's a really difficult time. Marianne, I hope you got everything you needed. If that is it, I think there's no more questions or comments. Mel, thank you so much for your time and your evening. Wishing you all the best, and speak soon.
Enjoy playing with those exercises that we send you.
Good night.